August 15th, 1831. Southampton County, Virginia. The morning mist clung to the tobacco fields like smoke from a dying fire. In a small cabin at the edge of Turner's plantation, a man knelt in prayer, but his words weren't asking for mercy. They were asking for strength. His name was Caleb, and the white folks called him Preacher because he could quote scripture like he'd written it himself. What they didn't know was that every verse he recited, every hymn he hummed while picking cotton, was building towards something they'd never see coming. By sunset that day, the sound of axes would echo through the Virginia countryside, but they wouldn't be chopping wood. They'd be chopping chains. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one don't make it into history books. The air that morning tasted different. Not just the usual mix of sweat and dirt that filled every breath on Turner's plantation. Something sharper cut through it. Something that made the horses restless and sent the dogs slinking under porches with their tails low. Caleb felt it too. That electric tension that comes before lightning splits the sky. He'd been feeling it for weeks now, ever since the vision came to him during Sunday service. He was a small man, Caleb. Barely 5.5 feet tall, with hands that looked too gentle for field work. But his eyes carried the weight of every prayer whispered in the dark. Every lash counted in silence. Every name carved into memory. The other slaves called him Preacher, not because any white man had given him that title, but because when Caleb spoke, God seemed to listen. That morning he rose before dawn like he always did. Not because the overseer demanded it, but because the quiet hours before sunrise belonged to him. In those moments, when the world held its breath between night and day, Caleb could hear something other than orders and curses. He could hear the voice that had been calling to him for months, growing louder each day, more insistent, more clear. The plantation stretched out before him in the pale light, row after row of tobacco plants that had grown fat on the backs of men who would never taste freedom. Turner's big house sat on the hill like a white throne, windows dark, chimneys cold. Down in the quarters, families slept pressed together in spaces too small for dignity. Children curled against mothers who hummed lullabies that sounded more like funeral songs. Caleb walked among them, these people who carried his blood, his pain, his hope. There was Moses, the field hand whose back looked like a road map of scars. Sarah, who'd birthed 7 children and watched 4 sold away before they could walk. Old Samuel, whose white hair had earned him the right to tend the garden instead of breaking his spine in the tobacco rows. Each face told a story of endurance, of survival, of faith tested beyond breaking. But something had shifted in recent weeks. The way they looked at him during evening prayers had changed. No longer the vacant stare of the beaten, but something sharper, hungrier. When he spoke of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt, their heads nodded with understanding that went deeper than scripture. When he read from Exodus about the plagues that brought Pharaoh to his knees, their eyes lit with a fire that had nothing to do with salvation and everything to do with justice. The visions had started 3 months ago, right after they brought in the new overseer. Hampton was his name, a thin man with yellow teeth and a voice like broken glass. He'd come from the deep plantations of Georgia, where they said a slave's life was worth less than the rope used to hang him. Hampton brought new rules, new punishments, new ways to break spirits that had somehow remained unbroken. It was during one of Hampton's whipping sessions that the first vision came. Caleb was forced to watch as the overseer laid 20 lashes across the back of a boy who couldn't have been more than 15. The crime was looking up when Hampton spoke instead of keeping his eyes on the ground. As each lash fell, as the boy's screams cut through the morning air, something cracked open inside Caleb's mind. He saw flames dancing across the Virginia countryside. He saw men in chains rising like wheat in the wind. He saw blood, not just flowing, but speaking, crying out from the ground for justice that had been denied for generations. And through it all, he heard a voice, deep and terrible and righteous, telling him that the time for patience had passed. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He walked to the edge of the plantation, where the pine trees grew thick and the moonlight couldn't penetrate. There, in the darkness that felt more honest than any daylight he'd known, he fell to his knees and asked the question that had been burning in his chest for months. "Lord, how long must we wait?" The answer came not in words, but in images that seared themselves into his memory. He saw the plantation owners gathered for their Sunday dinners, laughing over wine while children in the quarters went hungry. He saw auction blocks where families were torn apart like paper dolls. He saw graves without markers, dreams without hope, prayers without answers. And then he saw something else. He saw himself, standing not in a pulpit, but on a battlefield, not preaching submission, but proclaiming war. The vision lasted only moments, but when it ended, Caleb was no longer the same man who had knelt in the pine grove. He rose with purpose carved into his bones, with certainty flowing through his veins like fire. God hadn't called him to preach patience. God had called him to preach deliverance. And deliverance, he now understood, wouldn't come through prayer alone. The next Sunday, his sermon was different. Instead of speaking about bearing crosses and turning the other cheek, he talked about David facing Goliath. Instead of preaching about heavenly rewards, he spoke of Moses drowning Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea. The congregation felt the change. They leaned forward in their wooden pews, eyes bright, hands gripping their knees. Even the children stopped fidgeting when Caleb's voice rose and fell like thunder rolling across distant hills. But it wasn't just his words that had changed. Caleb himself was transforming. The gentle preacher who had once counseled forgiveness began meeting with small groups after services, not for prayer circles, but for something else entirely. He spoke in whispers about signs and wonders, about dreams that felt more real than waking life, about a God who had grown tired of watching his children suffer in silence. Word spread through the plantation like smoke through dry grass. Not openly, never openly, but in the way that important news always travelled among people who had learned to communicate without words. A glance held too long. A hymn hummed with different emphasis. A prayer that asked for strength instead of patience. The community began to organise itself around something they hadn't dared hope for in generations. The possibility of freedom. Caleb knew they were watching him now. Hampton's pale eyes followed him during work, searching for signs of rebellion in the way he carried himself. The house slaves whispered warnings that the master had been asking questions about the preacher's sermons, about whether his words carried any dangerous ideas. But fear, which had once kept Caleb awake at night, now felt as distant as childhood. The visions came regularly now, each one more vivid than the last, each one confirming what he already knew in his heart. The time for waiting was over. The time for action had begun. And as the morning mist lifted from the tobacco fields on the August day, as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, Caleb made his final preparations. Not for another day of back-breaking labour under the Virginia sun, but for something that would shake the foundations of a world built on the assumption that some men were born to be free, while others were born to serve. He gathered his small band of believers, men whose faith had been forged in the furnace of oppression, whose trust in him ran deeper than their fear of consequences. They met in the shadow of the barn where corn was stored, where the thick walls would muffle their voices and the smell of grain would cover any scent of conspiracy. Moses was there, his scarred back straight with purpose. Samuel, whose age had not dimmed the fire in his eyes. Young David, barely 20, but already bearing the weight of a lifetime's worth of injustice. And others, each carrying their own burden of pain, their own hunger for justice, their own willingness to risk everything for the chance to taste freedom. Caleb looked at each face in turn, seeing in them the reflection of his own transformation. These were no longer just field hands and house servants. They were soldiers in an army that had been gathering strength for generations, waiting for someone to sound the call to battle. The words Caleb spoke that morning in the barn weren't the gentle verses his congregation had grown accustomed to. These were different scriptures, pulled from the darkest corners of the Old Testament, where God's wrath fell like hammers on the heads of oppressors. His voice carried the authority of a man who had wrestled with angels and emerged with bones broken but spirit intact. "The Lord spoke to me in the night," he whispered, eyes moving from face to face. "He showed me rivers running red, not with clay, but with the blood of those who have made merchandise of his children. He showed me Egypt drowning in its own cruelty, Pharaoh's chariots swallowed by waters that had been held back too long." Moses shifted on his feet, the scars across his shoulders pulling tight. "What you saying, preacher?" "What the Lord wants us to do." Caleb's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of prophecy. He wants us to be his instruments, not his lambs led to slaughter, but his lions, awakened and hungry. He paused, letting the words settle into the silence thick as molasses. "Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the overseers drunk with their Saturday revelries, we move." The plan had been forming in his mind for weeks, each detail revealed through prayer and vision. They would start with the weapons stored in Turner's smokehouse: axes for splitting wood, knives for butchering hogs, hammers for building fences. Tools that had served masters would serve justice instead. From there, they would move methodically through the county, plantation by plantation, gathering strength with each victory. But this wasn't just about violence. Caleb understood something the other slave rebellions had missed. This was about righteousness, about divine justice flowing through human hands. Every action had to be sanctified, every death an offering on the altar of freedom. They wouldn't just kill masters, they would execute judgment. They wouldn't just destroy property, they would tear down the temples of an unholy system. Young David raised his hand, voice barely above a whisper. "Preacher, what about the women and children, the little ones in the big house?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb had wrestled with this through countless nights of prayer. In his visions he had seen blood flowing like rivers, but he had also seen innocent faces, white children who had never held a whip, women who had shown kindness when they thought no one was watching. "God knows his own," Caleb finally answered. "We are his sword, sharp and terrible, but he guides where it falls. We strike down the wicked, those who have grown fat on our suffering. But we are not murderers drunk on revenge. We are executioners carrying out divine judgment." Samuel, whose white hair had earned him small mercies over the years, spoke with the caution of age. "They'll come for us hard, preacher. Every white man in Virginia, maybe the whole South. They'll hunt us with dogs, hang us from every tree." Caleb nodded slowly. "I've seen our deaths too, brother. I've seen the gallows and the flames. But I've also seen something else." His voice dropped to barely a whisper, forcing them to lean closer. "I've seen the crack in the foundation, the first stone pulled from the wall that holds up their whole world. We may not live to see freedom, but our children will wake up in a different world because of what we do." The barn fell silent, except for the sound of breathing, heavy and deliberate. Each man weighed the preacher's words against his own heart, measuring faith against fear, hope against despair. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and someone's laughter carried on the wind from the direction of the big house. The sounds of a world that had no idea it was about to be shaken to its roots. Moses was the first to speak, his voice carrying the authority of scars earned and endured. "I've been carrying these marks on my back for 30 years, preacher. Every one of them a prayer for this day to come. If the Lord's ready to answer, then I'm ready to serve. One by one, they gave their assent. Not with grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but with simple nods, quiet amens, and hands placed on shoulders in brotherhood. They were past the point of debate. The time for talking had ended months ago, when Hampton first showed them what cruelty looked like when it stopped pretending to be civilized. As they prepared to leave the barn, to return to their daily routines of submission and silence, Caleb called them back with a gesture. From beneath his shirt, he pulled a small leather pouch, worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were strips of cloth, each one stained with something dark. Blood, he said simply. From every back split by the lash, every child sold away, every woman taken against her will. I've been collecting it, carrying it, praying over it. Tomorrow night we paint our faces with this blood, not as savages, but as priests preparing for holy work. He distributed the cloths among them, each man taking his portion with reverence, usually reserved for communion wine. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. They were taking the suffering of their people and transforming it into something sacred, something powerful. The rest of that Saturday passed like any other. Caleb preached his evening service with the same gentle authority he'd always possessed, leading hymns that spoke of Jordan's far shore and streets paved with gold. But underneath the familiar melodies, the congregation sensed something different. The way he emphasized certain words, the longer pauses between verses, the intensity in his eyes that seemed to burn straight through to their souls. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of the plantation, memorizing every path, every hiding spot, every potential escape route. The August heat hadn't broken with sunset, and sweat ran down his back like baptismal water. Above him, stars wheeled across the sky, in patterns that seemed to spell out promises written in a language older than words. He found himself at the old oak tree, where they'd buried 3 children the previous winter, victims of a fever that had swept through the quarters while the big house remained untouched. Their graves were unmarked, like so many others, but Caleb knew exactly where each small body lay. He knelt between them, placing his hands flat on the earth. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "tomorrow we settle accounts." A sound made him turn. Sarah approached through the darkness, moving with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to walk without disturbing sleeping masters. She carried something in her hands, a bundle wrapped in rough cloth. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, settling beside him. "Been thinking about my babies, the ones they took." Her voice carried no bitterness, only a weariness so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. Marcus would be 15 now if he lived. Little Ruth, she'd be walking, talking, probably helping in the kitchen. She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small wooden cross carved from hickory, polished smooth by countless hands. Made this for Marcus when he was born. Figured he'd need God's protection in this world. She held it out to Caleb. "Want you to carry it tomorrow. Maybe it'll help you remember what we're fighting for." Caleb took the cross, feeling its weight in his palm. It was warm from Sarah's body heat, alive in a way that spoke of love poured into wood grain, of prayers whispered over sleeping children, of hope that refused to die, even when everything else had been taken away. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," he said, more to the graves than to Sarah. "We're fighting for everyone who came before, everyone who'll come after. Every name they tried to erase, every dream they tried to kill." Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more words. She rose to leave, then paused. "Preacher, when it's over, when they come for us with their ropes and their fires, will God forgive us?" Caleb looked up at her. This woman who had endured more than any human should have to bear, who still worried about her soul, even as she prepared to risk everything for freedom. "Sister, I think God's been waiting for us to forgive ourselves." for being angry, for wanting justice, for refusing to die quiet and grateful. The cross seemed to pulse in his hand like a heartbeat. Tomorrow would bring violence, blood, and almost certainly death. But tonight, in the space between one breath and the next, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the false peace of submission, but the deep, abiding peace of a man who had finally stopped running from his destiny and started walking toward it with open arms. The Sunday that followed felt like the last day of the old world. Caleb moved through the familiar rhythms of worship with hands that already felt stained by tomorrow's work. His congregation filled the small wooden chapel, faces upturned like flowers seeking light, voices raised in hymns that seemed to carry more weight than usual. But beneath the surface of normalcy, currents of anticipation ran deep and dangerous. During the service, Caleb's eyes found each of his chosen men. Moses sat in the third pew, back straight, despite the scars that painted his shoulders. Samuel nodded from the corner where the old folks gathered, his white hair catching the morning light like cotton ready for harvest. Young David fidgeted near the door, energy coiled tight as a spring under pressure. Each man carried the secret like a burning coal in his chest, hot and necessary and impossible to ignore. The sermon Caleb delivered that morning would be remembered long after the events that followed. He spoke from the book of Joshua, about walls falling at the sound of trumpets, about cities taken not by human strength, but by divine command. His voice rose and fell like wind through wheat fields, carrying promises wrapped in parables, hope disguised as scripture. The Lord told Joshua to march around Jericho 7 times, Caleb preached, his hands gripping the rough wooden pulpit. Not 6 times, not 8, 7. Because God's timing is perfect, brothers and sisters. His patience has limits, and when those limits are reached, the walls come tumbling down. In the back of the chapel, Hampton stood with his arms crossed, pale eyes scanning the congregation for signs of trouble. The overseer had developed a habit of attending Sunday services, not out of any religious conviction, but to watch for the kind of fervor that made slaves forget their place. Today, something in Caleb's tone made his jaw clench, though he couldn't put his finger on what exactly troubled him. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the humid Virginia afternoon, Caleb lingered at the door. He shook hands with his parishioners, blessed their children, offered comfort to the grieving. But his words carried double meanings now, layers of significance that only the initiated would understand. To Moses, he said, "Remember, brother, the Lord provides strength for every burden." Moses nodded, understanding that strength would be needed before dawn. To Samuel, he whispered, "The harvest is ripe, old friend. Time to gather what we've sown." Samuel's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with purpose. To young David, barely more than a boy, but aged beyond his years by plantation life, Caleb placed a firm hand on the shoulder. "Be ready, son. God calls his warriors at the appointed hour." David's nod was sharp, decisive, carrying none of the uncertainty that had plagued him in the barn. As the last of the congregation departed, Caleb found himself alone with Sarah. She approached the pulpit where he still stood, her footsteps echoing in the empty chapel like heartbeats in a chest gone quiet. "It's really happening, isn't it?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. The wooden cross she'd given him the night before hung now around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt but warm against his skin. "Tomorrow night," he confirmed, "when the moon is dark and the righteous sleep sound in their beds, we wake up justice." Sarah's hands trembled as she straightened the hymnals scattered across the pews. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old country before the ships came. Said there were warriors there who painted their faces with clay and blood, who fought spirits as well as men. Maybe that's what you're doing, preacher. Fighting spirits." Caleb considered her words as he watched dust motes dance in the afternoon light streaming through the chapel's single window. Maybe we are. The spirit that says some men are born to own others. The spirit that turns children into property and women into breeding stock. Those spirits need killing more than any flesh and blood master. The rest of Sunday passed in a haze of final preparations. Caleb walked the plantation grounds one last time, memorizing every detail. The smokehouse where the axes waited, sharp and hungry for work other than splitting logs. The path through the pine grove that led to the main road, where they would begin their march through the county. The old cemetery where so many of their people lay buried without names, graves that would soon have company. As evening approached, families gathered for their final meal together, though none spoke of it that way. Children played their games while mothers hummed lullabies that sounded more like war songs. Fathers sat on cabin steps, whittling and smoking and thinking thoughts too dangerous for daylight. Caleb made his rounds through the quarters, ostensibly offering evening prayers but actually delivering final instructions. Each conversation seemed casual, a preacher checking on his flock, but underneath the surface, battle plans took shape with the precision of scripture verses. "Remember," he told each group, "we move like the angel of death through Egypt, swift, certain, righteous. We are not murderers drunk on revenge. We are instruments of divine justice, sharp and clean and necessary." The distinction mattered to him, this difference between killing and executing judgment. In his visions, he had seen blood flowing like rivers, but it was sacrificial blood, offered on the altar of freedom. Every life taken would be weighed against the lives ground down by chains. Every death measured against the children sold at auction blocks. Every scream answered by the silent screams of women taken in darkness. Night fell with unusual swiftness, as if the sky itself conspired to hide what was coming. Caleb sat on his cabin step, watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening expanse above. The August heat had finally broken, leaving behind air that felt charged, electric, alive with possibility. Around midnight, they began to gather, not all at once, not in any way that would draw attention, but in small groups that seemed to materialize from shadow and silence. Moses arrived first, moving through the darkness with the practiced stealth of a man who had learned to hunt by necessity. Samuel followed, his white hair covered by a dark cloth that made him nearly invisible. David came last, eyes bright with anticipation and terror in equal measure. They met in the pine grove where Caleb had received his first vision, where God had first spoken to him of walls falling and rivers running red. The darkness under the trees felt sacred now, heavy with the weight of prophecy about to be fulfilled. Caleb reached into his shirt and withdrew the small pouch Sarah had given him, the one containing strips of cloth stained with the blood of their suffering. "Paint your faces," he whispered, distributing the cloths among his followers. "Not as savages, but as priests preparing for holy work. Let the blood of our people mark us as servants of justice." They painted themselves in silence, smearing dark stains across foreheads and cheeks in patterns that seemed to come from racial memory, from some deep place where the knowledge of warriors lived on despite generations of enforced submission. When they were finished, they looked like something from the Old Testament, terrible and beautiful and absolutely committed to their cause. Caleb produced the wooden cross Sarah had carved for her lost son, holding it up where starlight could catch its polished surface. "We carry this not as Christians going meekly to slaughter, but as soldiers carrying the banner of righteousness into battle. Every blow we strike, every life we take, every chain we break, we do in the name of justice too long delayed." The smokehouse stood 50 yards away, dark and silent, its heavy door secured only by a wooden bar that could be lifted by determined hands. Inside waited the tools that would transform field hands into warriors, implements of labor that would become instruments of liberation, axes for splitting more than firewood, knives sharpened for purposes beyond butchering hogs, hammers that would build more than fences. Moses stepped forward, his scarred back straight with purpose. Preacher, what about after? When the sun comes up and they see what we've done? Caleb looked at each face in turn, seeing in the darkness the reflection of his own certainty. After, we keep moving. Plantation to plantation, county to county, until every chain is broken or every one of us is dead. We are the stone thrown into still water, brothers. The ripples will spread whether we live to see them or not. Young David's voice cracked with emotion. My mama always said I was born for something special. Guess this is it. This is it, Caleb confirmed. Tonight we stop being slaves and start being men. Tonight we stop asking for freedom and start taking it. Tonight, the Lord settles accounts through our hands. They move toward the smokehouse like shadows given substance, like prayers taking physical form. The wooden bar lifted easily, as if it too had grown tired of holding back what was meant to be released. Inside, metal gleamed in the darkness, edges sharp and hungry for work that had nothing to do with crops or livestock. Each man chose his weapon with the solemnity of communion. Moses took a broad axe, its handle worn smooth by years of labor. Samuel selected a long-bladed knife, testing its edge against his thumb until blood welled dark. David chose a hammer, heavy enough to drive nails through thick wood, heavy enough to drive justice through thick skulls. Caleb armed himself last, taking up a hatchet that seemed to fit his hand like it had been waiting for him. The metal was cold against his palm, but it warmed quickly, as if responding to the heat of his purpose. This was the instrument God had chosen for him, the tool by which divine will would be enacted upon an unjust world. They stood for a moment in the smokehouse doorway, transformed men holding transformed tools, poised at the threshold between the world they had known and the world they were about to create. Behind them lay generations of suffering, centuries of injustice, lifetimes of dreams deferred and hopes crushed. Ahead lay uncertainty, violence, almost certain death, but also something more precious than life itself, the chance to die as men rather than property. Caleb raised his hatchet toward the star-filled sky, and his voice carried the authority of prophecy fulfilled. Lord, we come before you not as slaves begging for mercy, but as soldiers requesting orders. Guide our hands, strengthen our arms, and let our blood water the seeds of freedom for generations yet unborn. The others raised their weapons in silent salute, metal catching starlight like prayers made manifest. In the distance, a dog howled, long and mournful, as if it could sense the change coming on the wind. The sound faded into silence, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine needles and the steady breathing of men who had finally, after lifetimes of waiting, found their moment to act. Turner's plantation house sat on the hill like a white monument to everything they were about to tear down. Windows glowed with lamplight, casting warm rectangles across manicured gardens where no slave was allowed to walk. Inside those walls, the master and his family slept the peaceful sleep of those who had never questioned their right to own other human beings. That peace was about to end. The age of slavery in Southampton County had exactly 6 hours left to live. The first house they approached belonged to Joseph Travis, a wheelwright who had purchased Nat Turner earlier that year. But tonight, Turner wasn't the leader. Tonight, he was just another soldier in Caleb's army of righteousness. The preacher had seen this moment in his visions, seen Travis's face twisted in surprise as justice came calling at his door. They moved through the darkness like whispers given form. Caleb led them up the path he had walked 100 times in daylight, carrying messages, delivering tools, playing the role of the obedient servant. But the man who walked that path now carried no messages of submission. He carried the collective rage of his people, sharpened to a killing edge. The front door stood unlocked, as doors often did in a world where white folks never imagined their property might rise against them. Caleb pushed it open with the same gentle touch he used when turning Bible pages, but his other hand gripped the hatchet with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. Inside, the house smelled of comfort. Beeswax candles and pipe tobacco, fresh bread and polished wood. The sense of a life lived without chains, without fear, without the constant weight of another man's ownership pressing down like stones on a grave. These were the smells Caleb's people would never know, the simple pleasure of a home that belonged to them. Moses moved through the parlor like smoke, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. Samuel positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, white hair covered by shadow, knife gleaming in his weathered hand. Young David stood by the kitchen door, hammer raised, ready to prevent any escape toward the back of the house. Caleb climbed the stairs alone, each step a prayer, each creak of old wood, a verse from his personal scripture of retribution. At the top, he paused outside the master bedroom, listening to the sound of peaceful breathing from within. Travis slept the sleep of the righteous, never dreaming that righteousness was about to visit him with steel in its hand. The bedroom door opened without resistance. Inside, Joseph Travis lay sprawled across a feather mattress that could have housed 3 slave families. His wife slept beside him, one pale arm draped across his chest. They looked innocent in sleep, defenseless as children. For a moment, Caleb hesitated, the human part of him recognizing the humanity in their vulnerability. But then he remembered the auction block, where families were torn apart like paper dolls. He remembered the whipping post, where men were flayed for the crime of exhaustion. He remembered the children sold before they could walk, the women taken in darkness, the names scratched from ledgers as if erasing words could erase souls. The hatchet fell with surgical precision. Travis never woke, never knew that his world had ended until he was already standing at the gates of whatever judgment awaited men who made merchandise of God's children. His wife stirred, opened her eyes, saw Caleb standing over her husband's still form. Her scream died in her throat as Moses appeared in the doorway, understanding passing between the 2 men without words. They worked quickly after that, moving through the house with the efficiency of men who had planned every movement, every moment. The Travis family had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, ranging in age from 16 down to barely walking. Caleb had wrestled with this part of his vision, had spent sleepless nights asking God what justice demanded of innocents born into a system they had not created. The answer had come during one of his prayer sessions, clear as thunder across still water. The sins of the fathers would be visited upon the children, not because the children were guilty, but because the system itself was guilty. Every white child raised in luxury, built on black suffering, was a future master, a future overseer, a future link in the chain that bound his people. The tree of slavery would continue to bear poisonous fruit until it was cut down at the root. But even divine justice could be merciful. The younger ones went quickly, quietly, passing from sleep to whatever lay beyond without terror or pain. The older boy, nearly grown and already showing the arrogance that came with white skin in Virginia, fought briefly before Moses's blade found its mark. Only the girl, perhaps 14, had time to truly understand what was happening before David's hammer ended her awakening. By the time they finished, the Travis house looked like a temple after sacrifice. Blood painted the walls in patterns that spoke of justice finally, brutally, necessarily served. They took what weapons they could find, a musket and powder, some knives from the kitchen, tools that would serve their growing army. Then they set fire to the curtains, watching flames dance across fabric that had never known the touch of enslaved hands. Outside, the night air felt cleaner somehow, as if the smoke rising from the burning house carried away decades of accumulated sin. Caleb stood in the yard, watching orange light flicker against the stars, feeling something shift inside his chest. The first blood had been spilled, The first blow struck. There was no turning back now. No pretending this was still a world where slaves knew their place, and masters slept secure in their beds. Moses wiped his blade clean on the grass, the steel gleaming wet and hungry for more work. "Where to next, preacher?" Caleb consulted the map he carried in his memory, the careful survey of Southampton County he had conducted during years of seeming submission. Salathiel Francis lives about a mile north, keeps 12 slaves, and thinks himself a Christian because he feeds them Christmas dinner once a year. They moved through fields of tobacco and corn, crops that had grown fat on the sweat of men who would never taste their profits. The night was full of sounds now that hadn't been there before. Dogs barking in the distance, confused by smoke on the wind. Horses stamping restlessly in their stalls, sensing something wrong in the air. Even the insects seemed to hiss with unusual intensity, as if nature itself recognized that the natural order was being overturned. At the Francis place, they found the slave quarters first, 12 souls huddled in 3 cabins that wouldn't have housed livestock properly on a decent farm. Caleb approached the first door and knocked softly, the way he had when making pastoral visits. A woman's voice answered, cautious, afraid. "Sister Mary?" "It's Preacher Caleb. Open the door." Mary Francis, no relation to the master despite sharing his name, cracked the door and peered out. She was 40 years old but looked 60. Her face carved by decades of labour and loss. When she saw Caleb's painted features, his companions armed with steel, her eyes widened with understanding that went deeper than surprise. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. "It's finally happening. The Lord's mercy is for those who deserve it," Caleb replied. "Tonight we serve his justice instead. Wake the others, sister. Tell them freedom has come calling, and she's got a sharp edge." Word spread through the quarters like fire through dry grass. Doors opened, faces appeared, voices rose in whispers that carried the weight of prayers finally answered. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stared as if they couldn't believe their eyes. But all understood what was being offered. Not just liberation from this particular plantation, but participation in something larger. Something that would shake the foundations of the world they knew. Most joined without hesitation. Men who had bent their backs in Francis's fields for decades, straightened their spines, and reached for whatever weapons they could find. Women who had served in the big house with downcast eyes, raised their heads and spoke with voices that rang like church bells. Even the children seemed to understand that this night was different, that the old rules no longer applied. But not everyone was ready for revolution. Old Jacob, bent nearly double with arthritis and a lifetime of submission, shook his head when offered a place in their ranks. "I'm too old for this kind of trouble, preacher." "Master Francis ain't the worst of them. Maybe if we just ask nice." Caleb placed a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder. "Brother, I understand your fear. But asking nice got us nothing but scraps and promises. Tonight, we stop asking and start taking." Jacob's eyes filled with tears that caught the starlight like diamonds. "They'll kill us all for this, every last one of us. They've been killing us all along," Moses interjected, his voice carrying the authority of scars. "Just slower, quieter, at least this way we die like men." In the end, 8 of the Francis slaves joined their growing army. The others, paralyzed by fear or broken by years of conditioning, stayed behind to face whatever consequences morning would bring. Caleb felt sorrow for them, but not judgment. Every man had to choose his own moment to stand, his own hill to die on. Tonight was his moment, and theirs, but not everyone's. Caleb's rebellion lasted only 48 hours, but those 2 days shattered the illusion of peaceful bondage that had sustained Virginia's plantation system for generations. By the time militia forces cornered the surviving rebels, over 50 white lives had been claimed, and the entire South trembled with the realization that their human property had teeth. Caleb himself was captured, tried, and hanged within weeks, but his final words from the gallows carried the weight of prophecy. "You can kill the messenger," he declared, "but you cannot silence the message." The blood spilled in Southampton County watered seeds of resistance that would bloom into civil war 30 years later, proving that sometimes the most powerful sermons are preached not from pulpits, but from the edge of right, else fury